The sky over the Solomon Islands is a canvas of brilliant blue and terrifying emptiness. For a pilot, it is both a sanctuary and a hunting ground. But what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? When the familiar roar of your engine sputters and the dark shapes of enemy fighters multiply on the horizon? There is no one to call, no ground to retreat to. There is only the vast, indifferent sky, the failing machine around you, and a choice that must be made in a fraction of a second. It is in moments like these that the true nature of a person is revealed. His story begins far from the Pacific Theater, on the windswept plains of South Dakota. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Joseph Jacob Foss was born into a world of sprawling fields and immense skies, the eldest son in a bustling Norwegian-American family. Life on the farm near Sioux Falls was defined by the rhythms of the land, a relentless cycle of hard work and simple rewards. It was a place that taught self-reliance from an early age, where a broken piece of machinery could not wait for a repairman, and a day's labor was measured in sweat, not hours. This was the landscape that shaped him, a world where survival depended on one's own two hands. But his eyes were always turned upward. He was just a boy when Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, an event that captured the imagination of a generation. For young Joe, it was more than just a news story. It was a revelation. He later recalled seeing a group of Marine Corps pilots, their planes gleaming in the sun, performing aerial maneuvers with a grace that seemed impossible. He stood there with his father, watching these men dance in the sky, and a quiet, unshakable ambition took root. He did not just want to watch them, he wanted to be one of them. The Great Depression cast a long shadow over those dreams. Then, when Joe was just a teenager, a sudden tragedy struck that would alter the course of his life forever. His father was killed in an accident, leaving Joe and his mother to manage the family farm and raise his younger siblings. The carefree days of boyhood were over. He was thrust into a world of adult responsibility, forced to make decisions that would determine his family's survival. The weight of this loss, the sudden burden of leadership, could have broken him. Instead, it seemed to temper him, forging a resilience that would later define him in the cockpit. He never let go of the dream. He worked his way through college, taking any job he could find to pay for tuition and eventually for flying lessons. Every dollar was earned through sheer effort, every hour in the air a precious victory against the odds. He was not a natural, not one of those pilots born with an innate feel for the machine. He was methodical, determined, and stubborn. He studied, he practiced, and he pushed himself, learning the mechanics of flight with the same practical diligence he had applied to fixing a tractor back on the farm. This was not a path of privilege or luck. It was a slow, arduous climb, built on a foundation of grit and an unwavering focus on that memory of pilots dancing in the sky. The world was tilting toward war. For a man who had spent his life looking at the sky, the choice seemed preordained. When the news from Pearl Harbor echoed across the country, it was not a question of if he would serve, but how. He walked into a recruiter's office older than most of the fresh-faced volunteers, a man in his mid-20s with a quiet confidence and a pilot's license already in his pocket. He was not looking for the easiest path. He was looking for the most demanding one. He chose the Marine Corps. It was a curious decision for an aviator. The Army Air Forces had more planes, the Navy had the carriers, but the Marines had a reputation forged in grit and hardship, an ethos of being the first to fight. Perhaps it was the farm boy in him, the one who understood that the toughest jobs required the most resolve. He was not joining a service, he was joining a brotherhood, defined by its willingness to take on the impossible. This choice, more than any other, seemed to reveal a fundamental part of his character. The training regimen was a shock to the system. This was not the leisurely flying he had known over the plains of South Dakota. This was a world of rigid discipline, of split-second calculations, where the slightest error could have fatal consequences. His age, which had once felt like a disadvantage, now seemed to lend him a certain gravity. He was more mature, more focused than many of the younger cadets. Yet this maturity also marked him for a different kind of role, one he had not anticipated and certainly did not want. The machine he was trained to master was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It was not the most elegant fighter in the air. Compared to the nimble Japanese Zero, it was heavy, less maneuverable, but it was built like a tractor from his father's farm, stubborn, powerful, and incredibly tough. It could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and still bring its pilot home. In a way, the plane was a reflection of the men who flew it. It was an underdog's weapon, one that demanded skill and tactical thinking over raw performance. His proficiency in the cockpit was quickly recognized, but not in the way he hoped. The command saw a steady hand, a calm demeanor, an excellent pilot who was perhaps too old for the reckless abandon of frontline combat. They saw a perfect instructor. So while other younger pilots were shipping out to the Pacific, he was assigned to a training base in Florida, tasked with teaching others the skills he was desperate to use himself. For a man burning with the desire to join the fight, it must have been a deeply frustrating exile. He did not accept this fate passively. He began a quiet but persistent campaign to get into the war. He made his case to his superiors, arguing that his experience and his skills were being wasted. He was not insubordinate, but he was unyielding. This was the same determination that had driven him to earn his pilot's license against all odds, the same stubborn streak that had kept the family farm running after his father's death. He was not asking for a favor, he was demanding a chance to do his duty. Finally, his persistence broke through the wall of military bureaucracy. He received the orders he had been waiting for. He was being sent to the South Pacific, to a tiny, contested island that was rapidly becoming the focal point of the entire war. The name Guadalcanal was just beginning to be whispered with a mixture of dread and reverence. He was leaving the safety of a training field and flying directly into the heart of the storm. His arrival was a brutal introduction to the realities of combat. Henderson Field was not an airbase. It was a muddy, cratered strip of cleared jungle under constant threat from Japanese warships at night and enemy bombers by day. The conditions were primitive. Disease, especially malaria, was as dangerous as any enemy pilot. The heat was suffocating, the food was scarce, and the tension was a physical presence, a constant weight on the shoulders of every man there. This was the crucible where legends would be forged or broken. He was assigned as the executive officer of Marine Fighter Squadron 121. He was a leader, but he was also a newcomer, an unproven quantity in a sky full of veterans. The other pilots had already faced the enemy, had seen friends fall, had learned the brutal calculus of air combat. He had the rank, but he would have to earn their respect where it mattered most in the cockpit. Thousands of feet above the jungle canopy, with enemy fighters on his tail. His first combat patrol was a journey into a new dimension of reality. The familiar feeling of flight was now overlaid with a profound sense of vulnerability. The vast, empty sky was no longer a canvas for graceful maneuvers, it was a hunting ground, and he was scanning it with an intensity he had never known. He was searching for tiny, distant specks that could materialize into a deadly threat in a matter of seconds. Every cloud, every glint of sun off a distant wing was a potential harbinger of a life-or-death struggle. Then came the first encounter. The sight of the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft he had only ever seen in recognition manuals. It was everything the reports had said: agile, fast, and handled by skilled, battle-hardened pilots. There was no time for awe or for fear. There was only instinct, training, and the cold, hard focus required to survive. This was the test he had sought for so long, and it was happening in real time, with lethal stakes. His first victory was not a scene from a movie. It was a chaotic blur of motion, a fleeting window of opportunity in a swirling dogfight. A burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns, a trail of smoke, a plane falling away toward the sea. The feeling that followed was likely a complex cocktail of emotions. There was the surge of adrenaline, the relief of survival, but also the sobering, undeniable finality of what he had just done. He had taken a life, and in doing so, had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The learning curve was vertical, and the lessons were paid for in close calls. On one early mission, he was ambushed, his Wildcat torn apart by cannon shells. He managed to nurse the crippled aircraft back to Henderson Field, a testament to both his own skill and the plane's incredible durability. He saw firsthand that trying to outturn a Zero was suicide. He had to fight smarter, using different tactics that played to his own strengths. He and his squadron began to perfect a new way of fighting. They relied on teamwork, never flying alone. They used their plane's superior diving speed and heavy firepower to make slashing, high-speed attacks, refusing to get drawn into the turning fights the Zero excelled at. They embraced tactics like the thatch weave, where two Wildcats would cover each other, turning a pursuer into a target. It was a disciplined, intellectual approach to aerial combat, a chess match played at 400 miles per hour. Survival itself became a measure of success. He once found himself over enemy territory with a dead engine, his propeller windmilling uselessly. With no power, he became a glider, navigating his way back over the jungle, searching for the friendly confines of Henderson Field. He made a perfect dead-stick landing, a feat of incredible airmanship under the most intense pressure imaginable. These were the moments that truly defined a pilot, not just the victories, but the narrow escapes that were a matter of inches and seconds. The psychological strain was immense. The constant threat of death, the tropical diseases, the exhaustion, and the grief of losing comrades chipped away at everyone. He seemed to possess a remarkable calm, a focus that allowed him to compartmentalize the fear and concentrate solely on the mission at hand. It was a quiet, stoic leadership that steadied the younger pilots around him. He led not with speeches, but with his unwavering performance in the sky. His personal tally of victories began to climb steadily. 1, then 2, then 5, making him an ace. He was becoming known for his extraordinary marksmanship, a skill he credited to his years of hunting on the South Dakota prairie. He could calculate deflection and lead with an almost preternatural ability. He was not a reckless gunslinger, but a patient and methodical hunter. His reputation began to grow, not just within his squadron, but among the Japanese pilots who faced him. The skies over Guadalcanal became a personal dueling ground. He and the men of VMF 121 were no longer fighting a faceless enemy. They began to recognize the styles of certain Japanese aces, just as the enemy began to recognize the ferocity of this American squadron. The stakes were rising with every mission. His initial combat test was over. He was no longer just a pilot, he was becoming a predator, and his legend was just beginning to take flight. The name they were given was the Cactus Air Force, a nod to the code name for the island itself. It was a name born of desperation and grit. Their airfield, Henderson Field, was little more than a muddy, shell-pocked strip of earth carved from the jungle. There were no comfortable barracks, no hot meals, just tents, foxholes, and the constant, gnawing presence of the enemy. Japanese warships shelled them from the sea by night, and bombers attacked them from the air by day. It was a siege, and they were at the very center of it. Life was a grueling cycle of survival. Men flew multiple sorties a day, landing only to refuel and rearm before taking to the skies again. The heat was suffocating, the food was often contaminated, and tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery were as much an enemy as the Japanese pilots. He, like so many others, suffered from the fever, losing weight, his body racked with chills. Yet, every time the scramble alarm sounded, he would pull himself into the cockpit, his personal misery secondary to the mission. The stakes were impossibly high. Every flight was a direct defense of the thousands of United States Marines clinging to their precarious foothold on the island. If the Cactus Air Force failed, if they lost control of the sky, the ground campaign would be indefensible. This reality imbued every dogfight with a desperate importance. It was not about personal glory or racking up a score. It was about buying one more day for the men on the ground, about keeping the supply lines open, about holding the line at all costs. This environment seemed to sharpen his focus to a razor's edge. While others understandably frayed under the pressure, he seemed to grow more centered. He developed a routine that was almost monastic in its simplicity. He meticulously cared for his aircraft and his weapons, trusting in his tools as an extension of his own will. He studied enemy tactics, debriefed every mission with his pilots, and conserved his energy for the moments that mattered most, those critical seconds in the air when instinct and training took over. In the cockpit of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, he was a master of a flawed but formidable machine. The Wildcat could not outclimb or outturn the nimble Zero, but it was tough as iron and could dive like a stone. He knew its limitations intimately, and he never fought the enemy's fight. He used his plane's strengths, diving from above with the sun at his back, making a single devastating pass, and then using his speed to escape and climb for another attack. It was the cold, efficient calculus of a predator who understood his own power. The month of October 1942 would become the crucible. The Japanese launched an all-out offensive to retake Guadalcanal, throwing waves of bombers and fighters at Henderson Field. For him and the pilots of VMF 121, it was a period of unrelenting combat, a blur of takeoffs, dogfights, and landings under fire. The sky became a constant, swirling melee of tracers, flak, and falling aircraft. On one day during this intense period, he led his flight into a massive formation of Japanese planes. The sky was thick with them. There was no room for elaborate strategy, only for immediate, decisive action. He picked his target, a bomber, and rolled into a high side pass. His guns spoke in a short, controlled burst, and the bomber faltered, smoke pouring from an engine. He did not wait to watch it fall. He was already scanning for the next threat, his head on a constant swivel, a Zero latched onto his wingman. Without hesitation, he broke hard, pulling his Wildcat into a tight turn that strained the airframe, positioning himself on the enemy's tail. Another burst, and the Zero peeled away, trailing fire. He then saw another group of fighters diving on a different section of his squadron. He climbed to meet them, his engine screaming. In the space of just a few minutes, he had engaged multiple aircraft, his mind processing the complex geometry of the battle with astonishing speed and clarity. By the time he landed, his plane riddled with holes, his ammunition nearly spent. The ground crews were in disbelief. He was credited with shooting down 5 enemy aircraft in a single day. He had not only saved his fellow pilots, but had also single-handedly broken up a major enemy attack. A few weeks later, he would repeat a similar feat, again downing multiple aircraft in 2 separate sorties on the same day. His tally had grown at an incredible rate. He had achieved something that seemed almost impossible. In less than 2 months of combat, he had shot down 26 enemy aircraft. This tied the record set by America's great World War I ace, Eddie Rickenbacker. The farm boy from South Dakota, the quiet, determined pilot who had scraped together money for flying lessons, was now a living legend. He was the embodiment of the American fighting spirit in the Pacific. But the man who stepped out of the cockpit was not the same one who had arrived on Guadalcanal. He was gaunt, exhausted, and running on fumes. He had pushed his mind and body to the absolute limit, surviving not just the enemy, but the island itself. He had become the ace of aces, a symbol of hope and defiance in the darkest days of the Pacific War. The question was, what was the price for such a rapid, legendary ascent? How long could any human being sustain that level of intensity before the body or the mind finally gave way? The answer came not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, insidious creep of exhaustion and disease. The same jungle that concealed the enemy was also a relentless foe. Malaria, carried by the swarms of mosquitoes, began to work its way through the American ranks, and it did not spare the aces. He contracted the disease, and with it came the punishing cycles of fever and chills, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. He lost weight he could not afford to lose, his already lean frame becoming gaunt. Yet he kept flying. He would prop himself up in the cockpit, sometimes with a fever that would have grounded any other pilot, his will seemingly the only thing holding his body together. His squadron mates watched him with a mixture of awe and concern. He was their leader, their rock, but the rock was visibly cracking. There is a point where courage blurs into something else, a self-destructive drive that ignores every signal the body sends. He was flying straight past that point. The moment it all came apart happened not in the fury of a dogfight, but on a routine patrol over the sea. He was leading a flight of fighters to intercept a group of Japanese ships when his engine sputtered. A cough, then a sickening silence. The propeller windmilled to a halt. Below him was nothing but the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific Ocean. Malaita, the nearest island, was a distant green smudge on the horizon. There would be no gliding to safety. He fought the controls, trying to coax the dead machine into a controlled descent, aiming for a water landing that was notoriously dangerous in a wildcat. The plane was not designed for it. Its heavy engine and fixed landing gear tended to dig into the water, flipping the aircraft violently on impact. He braced himself. The impact was brutal, a jarring collision that slammed him against his restraints and filled the cockpit with a chaotic rush of seawater. He was underwater, disoriented in the sudden muffled quiet that follows a crash. He reached for the canopy release, but it was jammed. The fuselage was bending from the force of the impact, trapping him inside his own cockpit as it sank into the depths. Panic is a cold thing. He pushed with all his remaining strength, his lungs burning. For a moment, it seemed this was the end not by an enemy bullet, but by a mechanical failure. drowned in a sinking metal coffin miles from anyone who could help. Somehow, he forced the canopy open just enough to squeeze through. He surfaced, gasping for air, clutching a piece of wreckage. The relief was short-lived. He was alone in the open ocean, and he soon realized he was not entirely alone. The dark, triangular fins of sharks began to circle him, drawn by the disturbance. For hours, he floated, kicking and punching at the water whenever one of the predators grew too bold. The ace of aces, the hunter of the skies, was now just another piece of bait, fighting a primal battle for survival. Just as his strength was giving out, a canoe appeared, paddled by local islanders. They had seen his plane go down. They pulled his exhausted body from the water, away from the circling sharks, and took him to a coastal mission run by Australian missionaries. He was saved not by a military rescue operation, but by the simple humanity of people caught in the crossfire of a war that was not their own. What does it do to a man to be so thoroughly broken, only to be pieced back together by strangers in a canoe? He was eventually returned to Henderson Field, but he was a shadow of himself. The malaria, exacerbated by the ordeal, was now raging through his system. He was medically evacuated, his combat tour on Guadalcanal over. He had given everything he had, and then some. He had flown into the heart of the storm and somehow, against all odds, flown out the other side. But the man who left the island was not the same one who had arrived. Back in the United States, recovering, he was a curiosity, a living legend. The news of his 26 victories had made him a national hero. But for him, the war was still a visceral reality. He had left his squadron, his flying circus, behind in the jungle. He likely felt a sense of unfinished business, a disconnect between the parades and the grim memory of the things he had seen and done. Then came the official recognition. He was summoned to Washington. In a ceremony at the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt draped the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation spoke of his outstanding heroism and courage, of his indomitable fighting spirit. He stood there, the farm boy from South Dakota, shaking the hand of the president, the highest military decoration in the nation, now his. This was the culmination. Not a single dogfight, not one victorious day, but the entire grueling campaign. The climax of his military career was not just the act of shooting down enemy planes, but the act of surviving Guadalcanal. He had faced the best pilots the enemy had, battled a relentless disease, survived a crash at sea, and stared down sharks. The medal was a symbol for all of it. He was no longer just a pilot. He was now an icon, a potent symbol of American resilience. The military quickly put him to use, sending him on war bond tours across the country. He was asked to tell his story again and again, to inspire factory workers and rally public support. He was now part of the propaganda machine, his authentic, harrowing experience polished into a heroic narrative for public consumption. But one has to wonder what he thought about it all. Did the speeches and the applause feel real? Or did they feel like a pale imitation of the life and death reality he had just left behind? The climax of his career had transformed him from a warrior into a symbol. He had achieved the pinnacle of military recognition, but in the process, he may have lost a part of the quiet, determined man who had simply wanted to fly. He had become the face of American air power in the Pacific, a hero in a time that desperately needed one. His greatest victory was not just a tally in a logbook, but the simple, stubborn fact that he had endured. He had held the line during the darkest days of the war. He now wore the nation's highest honor, a testament to his extraordinary courage. But the war was far from over, and the path for a man who had already reached the summit is never a simple one. What does a hero do after the heroic part is done? The cost of becoming a legend is often paid in the quiet moments after the cheering stops. He was now a public figure, his face on posters, his name a household word. But this new role was a cage of its own. On the war bond tours, he stood before crowds of strangers, telling a sanitized version of his story. He spoke of teamwork and courage, but how could he possibly convey the smell of cordite and aviation fuel, the gut-wrenching lurch of a near miss, or the profound emptiness of seeing a friend's plane vanish in a fireball? He was selling a version of the war that was palatable for public consumption, while the real war continued to live inside him. The malaria he contracted in the jungle was not a memory, but a recurring affliction, leaving him weak and feverish for years to come. It was a constant physical reminder of the island that had nearly claimed him. He had lost his health, but he had also lost his anonymity. He was no longer just a man, but a symbol, and symbols do not get to have bad days or private grief. Perhaps the greatest loss was the camaraderie of the men he left behind. While he was being celebrated, they were still fighting, still facing the daily possibility of death. There is a unique burden that comes with being the one who makes it out, the one whose story gets told. He carried the weight of those who did not return, the faces of the young pilots who had looked up to him and who now existed only in memory. He had won the nation's highest honor, but the price was a kind of isolation that no medal could ever truly fill. He was a warrior who was no longer allowed to fight. The military command, understandably, saw him as too valuable an asset to risk in combat again. He was a morale booster, a recruitment tool. But for a man whose entire being was oriented toward action, this forced inactivity must have felt like a kind of prison. He lobbied, he argued, he pushed to be sent back to the Pacific, back to where he felt he belonged. He was not finished, not by a long shot. His persistence eventually paid off. In 1944, he was given command of another Marine fighter squadron, VMF 115. He was back in the war, but the war had changed. The desperate defensive battles of Guadalcanal were over. The United States was now on the offensive, island hopping across the Pacific. The Japanese Air Force, once a formidable opponent, was a shadow of its former self, its best pilots and planes long since lost. His role was different now, too. He was a commander, responsible for the lives of dozens of young pilots. His job was no longer just to be the best hunter in the sky, but to be a leader, a mentor, a strategist. He led his squadron on missions over heavily fortified islands, providing air support for the Marines on the ground. It was dangerous, grueling work, filled with anti-aircraft fire and the constant risk of mechanical failure. But it was not the swirling, one-on-one dogfighting that had made him famous. Interestingly, he never added to his tally of 26 aerial victories. It is possible the opportunities simply were not there. But it is also possible that his focus had shifted. The goal was no longer personal victory, but the success of the mission and the survival of his men. He had evolved from the lone ace into the protective shepherd of his flock, a transformation that speaks volumes about his character. He had already proven he could be the best. Now he had to prove he could lead the best. When the war finally came to an end in August of 1945, he was a seasoned commander who had seen the conflict from its desperate beginnings to its decisive conclusion. The news of the Japanese surrender must have been met with a profound sense of relief, but also a quiet uncertainty. For years, his life had been defined by a single, all-consuming purpose. Now that purpose was gone. The war had forged him into the man he was, but it was over. The farm boy from South Dakota had become a national hero, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a leader of men. The sky was no longer a battlefield, but the lessons he had learned there, in the crucible of combat, would shape everything that came next. Who was the man inside the cockpit? Beyond the medals and the newspaper headlines, what kind of person climbs into a machine of fabric and steel day after day to duel in the clouds? He was often described as unassuming, a man with an easy smile and a firm handshake, grounded in the plains of his youth. Yet, to do what he did required a certain kind of fire, a relentless competitive drive that is hard to square with the image of a simple farm boy. Was it patriotism that fueled him, or was it something more primal, the hunter's instinct honed to a razor's edge? Men who flew with him spoke of a quiet confidence, an almost preternatural calm in situations that would unravel most people. He did not seem to carry the swagger of some other aces. Instead, there was a deep-seated belief in his own abilities, forged over thousands of hours of flying long before the war ever began. He had a relationship with his aircraft that was almost intimate, a feel for its limits and its strengths that went beyond a technical manual. But this confidence must have coexisted with a profound understanding of his own mortality. How does a man balance that every morning, knowing the odds, knowing the cost, and still choose to fly towards the danger? His leadership style was said to be one of example, not of edict. He would not ask his men to do anything he would not do himself, and he had already done more than almost anyone. He was protective, almost paternal, with the young pilots who looked to him as a living legend. He understood the fear that lived in their hearts, because it lived in his too. Perhaps his greatest strength as a commander was not his tactical genius, but his empathy. He knew the burden of survival, the quiet guilt of coming back when others did not. He had to be more than a hero. He had to be a source of stability in a world of chaos. After the war, he never seemed to stop moving. He plunged into business, then politics, even hosting his own television show. It was a life lived at full throttle, a constant search for the next challenge, the next mission. One has to wonder if this relentless activity was a way of outrunning the silence. The sky over the Pacific had been a place of incredible violence and intensity, but it was also a place of profound purpose. How do you replace that? Maybe the constant motion was a way to keep from looking back too closely, to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. He was a man built for the storm, and he spent the rest of his life trying to find a peace that could match the war's intensity. There are stories, whispers in the margins of the official histories, that hint at a more complex picture. The idea of the natural pilot, the born ace, is a powerful one, but it might obscure a more interesting truth. His skill was not simply a gift, it was earned. It was the product of a relentless, almost obsessive dedication to the craft of flying that started years before Pearl Harbor. He understood energy, angles, and the three-dimensional geometry of combat in a way that others did not. Was it genius, or was it the result of a mind that simply never stopped calculating, never stopped practicing, even when he was on the ground? And what of luck? Skill can take a pilot far, but in the chaos of a dogfight, survival often comes down to a matter of inches, of seconds. He was shot down, forced to ditch his aircraft in the ocean, and once spent a night clinging to wreckage in shark-infested waters before being rescued by islanders. He survived bouts of malaria that would have broken a lesser man. How many times did a bullet miss him by a fraction? How many times did an enemy pilot make a fatal error at the last possible moment? To some, his survival seemed almost miraculous, as if he were being watched over. But perhaps the truth is that a warrior on that level makes his own luck, turning split-second chances into continued existence through sheer force of will. The world of fighter aces was a small, competitive fraternity. While the public narrative is one of brotherhood, it's only human to imagine there were professional rivalries, quiet tensions between men who were all striving to be the best. His fame was immense, eclipsing that of many other highly skilled pilots. Did this create jealousy? Was there a silent competition in the ready rooms and the officers' clubs, a contest measured in victories chalked up on a scoreboard? These were not men who were immune to pride or ambition. The official story smooths over these human complexities, but they were surely there, simmering just beneath the surface of the unified war effort. A legend can become its own kind of cage. As his reputation grew, did his enemies know who he was? Did Japanese pilots actively seek him out in the sky, hoping to claim the prize of shooting down America's greatest ace? And what kind of pressure does that place on a man? To know that you are not just a pilot, but a target, a symbol whose death would be a major propaganda victory for the other side. It adds another layer of psychological weight to an already unbearable burden. He had to fly not only against the enemy, but against his own myth, a legend of invincibility that every mission threatened to shatter. His value to the war effort went far beyond the cockpit. On the home front, he became something more than a pilot. He was a headline, a story of hope that could be printed in newspapers from New York to California. Here was a quiet young man from the farmlands of Wisconsin, unassuming and humble, who was methodically dismantling the enemy's air power. In a time of uncertainty and sacrifice, his string of victories was a tangible sign that the war could be won. He was proof that an ordinary American could become extraordinary. One has to wonder how many young men signed up to be pilots, how many factory workers pushed a little harder on the assembly line because of the story they read about him. This symbolic power had a strategic dimension. The military command was keenly aware of his value as a morale booster. He was eventually taken out of combat and sent home, not as a punishment, but as a promotion to a different kind of battlefield, the one for public opinion. He was sent on tours to promote war bonds, his famous face now a tool for fundraising. It must have been a strange and difficult transition. A man whose entire being was focused on the sharp, lethal reality of air combat was now asked to shake hands and smile for cameras. Did he feel like a warrior or a product? And what did it do to him? To be celebrated for a skill he was no longer allowed to use, while his friends were still fighting and dying thousands of miles away. The world he mastered, the world of propeller-driven aircraft and close-range cannon fire, was already vanishing as he reached the peak of his fame. The future was arriving at the speed of sound, in the form of jet propulsion. And in a turn of profound and tragic irony, this new age would claim him. After the war, he became a test pilot, pushing the boundaries of these new, powerful, and unpredictable machines. The man who had survived countless dogfights, who had faced down death in the skies over the Pacific, lost his life not in combat, but in a training accident in a new jet fighter over American soil. It is a haunting end to his story. The skills that made him a legend in one era did not translate to the next. His death marks a sharp, definitive line between the age of the dogfight and the dawn of the jet age. Today, his name is etched onto memorials, schools, and airports. He is a figure of history, a black and white photograph in a textbook. But his real legacy might be something less tangible. He helped solidify the archetype of the American fighter ace, the cool, quiet professional who lets his actions speak for him. This image persists in films, in books, and in the culture of military aviation itself. Yet, does this archetype truly capture the man? Or does it obscure the complex, flesh and blood individual who had to live with the fear, the pressure, and the profound strangeness of his own legend? In remembering the hero, we risk forgetting the human being who had to carry that immense weight, long after the sound of the guns had faded. The relationship between a singular talent and the vast military machine that directs it is always a complicated one. Superiors saw in him not just a pilot, but a strategic asset of immense value. General George Kenney, the commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, was famously protective of him. He reportedly allowed him a degree of freedom unheard of for a pilot of his rank, letting him fly when and where he chose, a hunter with a free rein. But this freedom was a double-edged sword. It acknowledged his supreme skill, but it also underscored that he was too valuable to lose. Was he a soldier following a chain of command? Or had he become something else, a kind of living weapon that the generals aimed but were terrified of breaking? This unique status must have created a strange distance between him and his peers. While he was being carefully managed from headquarters, another American pilot, Thomas Maguire, was also climbing the ranks of aces. Maguire was a different kind of man, more aggressive, more openly ambitious, a student of tactics who craved the title of America's best. The press loved the narrative of a race for the top spot, a friendly rivalry between two of the nation's greatest flyers. But what was the reality in the humid airbases of the Pacific? Was it truly a good-natured competition, or did it carry the harder edge of professional pride and the shadow of mortality? To be the best meant surviving when others did not. It is a grim sort of contest, where the final score is counted in lives, both enemy and one's own. Flying beside a legend carries its own weight. For the men in his squadron, his presence was likely a source of both immense confidence and subtle pressure. To fly as his wingman was to be partnered with the best, to learn from a master in the most demanding classroom in the world. But it also meant flying in a spotlight. Did they feel an unspoken duty to protect him, to ensure the national hero made it home? And what of the victories they claimed while flying in his shadow? The quiet professionalism of these squadrons is a matter of record, but the human element, the quiet resentments or the fierce loyalties that must have existed, are lost to the official histories. They were a team, but he was undeniably the star. His fame was not confined to American newspapers. In the joint operational environment of the Southwest Pacific, he flew alongside pilots from other nations, particularly the Royal Australian Air Force. To these men, who had been fighting in the region since the earliest days of the conflict, what did this quiet American represent? Was he seen as a symbol of the overwhelming industrial and military might that America brought to the war? Or was he simply recognized as a fellow warrior, a man whose extraordinary skill in the cockpit transcended nationality? The shared danger of the sky can forge bonds that ignore the flags painted on the side of a fuselage. One wonders if, in the quiet moments between missions, they shared stories and recognized in each other the same exhaustion, the same fear, and the same deadly focus. The public never truly knew the pilot. They knew the story, and the story was perfect. A humble boy from the farmlands of Wisconsin, quiet and polite, who just happened to be the most lethal aerial hunter the world had ever seen. This narrative was not an accident. It was a masterpiece of wartime public relations. It presented a hero who was not a swaggering warrior, but a citizen soldier, an ordinary American doing an extraordinary job. He was relatable. He was one of them. But how much of this carefully polished image reflected the complex man who had to live with the daily reality of killing? The myth of the simple farm boy may have obscured the sharp, calculating mind and the cold nerve required to do what he did, time and time again. His legend was powerfully amplified by a single iconic image painted on the nose of his P-38 Lightning. It was a photograph of his sweetheart, Marge Vatndal. The aircraft itself was named Marge. This single detail transformed his warplane from an impersonal machine of destruction into something deeply personal. It was a tangible link to the world he was fighting for, a symbol of love and home carried into the violent skies over New Guinea. For the American public, it was an irresistible story. Here was the knight of the air, fighting not for glory, but for the girl back home. It grounded his abstract tally of victories in a human emotion that everyone could understand, making him not just a hero, but a romantic hero. There was also the myth of the natural. He was often portrayed as an instinctive pilot, a man who did not need to think, who simply felt what his aircraft and his enemy would do next. His gunnery was described as uncanny, as if he were born with an intuitive understanding of deflection shooting. This narrative is compelling because it suggests a kind of genius that cannot be taught, a gift from the heavens. Yet it overlooks a crucial part of his story. Before becoming a combat pilot, he was a flight instructor, a teacher of the very skills he was said to possess by instinct. The truth is likely more complex and more impressive. He was a man who combined a profound natural talent with rigorous training and a deep, technical understanding of his craft. The myth of the natural is a good story, but the reality of the dedicated professional is the greater tribute. Even now, his story occupies a unique space in our memory of the war. In an age of satellite-guided munitions and remotely piloted drones, the idea of aerial combat as a personal duel between pilots in propeller-driven aircraft feels like it belongs to another, more romantic era. His legend reinforces this idea of a purer form of warfare, a contest of individual skill and courage. But is this a true reflection of his reality, or is it a nostalgic filter we apply today? His war was one of industrial-scale attrition, fought with machine guns and cannons at close range. The archetype he represents, the quiet ace from the heartland, endures because it fulfills a deep-seated need for heroes who are both supremely competent and fundamentally decent. His story tells us as much about our own ideals as it does about the man himself. The story we are told often smooths over the rough edges. We hear of the victories, the tally, the hero's return. But what about the moments in between? The reports from his early days in the Southwest Pacific paint a picture not of a prodigy, but of a pilot learning a brutal trade. He was part of a group of new flyers, thrown into a theater where the environment itself was as dangerous as the enemy. Tropical storms, vast expanses of ocean, and primitive airfields were a constant threat. In this crucible, many were lost without ever seeing an enemy plane. How did this quiet young man from Wisconsin not only survive but begin to develop the lethal skills that would define him? Was it luck, or was there an early sign of the methodical, observant hunter he would become? His combat style, when analyzed, reveals something far more deliberate and risky than simple natural talent. Gun camera footage from his P-38 shows a consistent pattern. He would often close to point-blank range, flying through the debris of his disintegrating target. Other pilots kept their distance, firing long, hopeful bursts, but he stalked his prey, waiting, getting so close that he could not miss. This was not the act of a man relying on instinct. It was the cold calculation of a predator who understood that the surest way to secure a kill was to eliminate chance entirely. It was an incredibly dangerous way to fight. One has to wonder what went through the minds of his wingmen, watching him press his attacks with what must have looked like a complete disregard for his own safety. Long before he was a national icon, he was a problem for his commanding officers. The quiet farm boy had a rebellious streak. During his training stateside, he was known for his low-level flying and aerial acrobatics, sometimes in places he was explicitly forbidden to be. There is a famous, perhaps apocryphal story of him flying a loop around the Golden Gate Bridge. Another, better documented incident involved him flying low down a main street in San Francisco and allegedly blowing laundry off a clothesline. He was grounded for these infractions. This behavior seems at odds with the humble persona presented to the public. Was this youthful recklessness, or was it the manifestation of a man who felt more at home testing the limits of his machine and his own nerve than he did with his feet on the ground? This tension between the pilot and the rules continued even at the height of his fame. General George Kenney, the commander of the 5th Air Force, recognized Bong's immense value, not just as a pilot, but as a symbol. He was a morale-boosting machine. After Bong surpassed the old American record of 26 victories, Kenney tried to send him home to protect his ace from the odds that eventually caught up with every combat pilot. But Bong resisted. He was a hunter, and the war was his hunting ground. He eventually returned to the Pacific, but under a strange new set of orders. He was assigned to a staff role, evaluating tactics, and was forbidden from actively seeking combat. It was an attempt to keep him safe while still using his expertise. But a man like that could not be kept out of the sky. He began flying non-operational missions, supposedly testing aircraft or familiarizing himself with the area. Inevitably, these flights would encounter enemy aircraft, and just as inevitably, he would engage them. His final string of victories, the ones that pushed his total to an untouchable 40, were scored while he was technically forbidden from fighting. This raises a fascinating question about his motivation. He was already the nation's top ace, a celebrated hero. He had nothing left to prove. So why did he continue to fly into danger? Was it a sense of duty, an addiction to the thrill of the chase, or something deeper, a simple, undeniable need to be in the cockpit, doing the one thing he did better than anyone else on Earth?